200 online.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the Norwich Public Library. My name is Lucinda Walker, and on behalf of the Norwich Public Library, I welcome you to our Snapshot event, Coming of Age in Vermont, Transits of Youth and a Complexly Interwoven World with Kristin Bright. We would like to extend our thanks to our partners at Vermont Humanities, as well as to the generous underwriters who make it possible for us to offer such rich and robust programming. The sponsor of our entire Snapshot season is the Vermont Department of Libraries in the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Tonight's event is sponsored by Mascoma Bank, and in addition, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Norwich Public Library for generously underwriting our host fee this year. Tonight, we come together from across the state to listen, to learn, and to be inspired in community. Before we begin, I'd just like a few brief housekeeping items. For those of you in the Norwich area, our Big Tree Quest program continues through next week, where we will have an all-ages tree and mindfulness hike scheduled next week. And if you are indeed participating in finding the biggest tree in Norwich, please submit your entries by 11:59 this Sunday night, October 22nd. Our next Snapshot event will be hosted by the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. It's called Live to See the Day, the Violence of Underfunded Schools and Poverty with Nikhil Goya on October 25th at 7 p.m. Be sure to register online to receive a link to the live stream, much like you have done tonight if you are watching on the live stream. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to our speaker. Kristin Bright grew up in Addison County, Vermont, and she is a professor of cultural and digital anthropology at Middlebury College. Her research focuses on the ways people imagine social worlds of connection, care, and futurity in schools, clinics, households, and other settings in Asia and North America. In 2017, she and her students founded an ethnographic research lab called The Body Online. More information at bodyonline.org. To understand how people imagine and interact with emerging practices of the body, technology, and activism online, including youth digital cultures. So please join me in welcoming Kristin Bright.
Thank you so much, Lucinda, for that warm reception. It is really a pleasure to be here in Norwich. My best friend actually grew up here and spent a lot of time here at this library. And so when I spent some time with her and her mother a few years ago, her mother lives at Kendall, we were sort of peeking in the windows because it wasn't open, but we were just sort of remembering all of the important connections she had through the books here. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and I want to also thank Jacob and Catherine from Vermont Humanities for the generous invitation to share our work tonight. And to all of you who are tuning in, it's really, I think, important to have these moments in our life, these ritual breaks where we can come together and think creatively and productively about human connection, both here in Vermont and in the world. So the first part of this talk is, a reflexive journey back into my own coming of age. As Lucinda mentioned, I grew up in Addison County, and that was, very much a part of my becoming interested in rural community and in school-based settings for health. But it was also a place where I learned a lot, particularly from my parents and grandparents, about the importance of traveling beyond yourself, really opening yourself up to other ways of being and thinking otherwise. And that was very much a part of, why I sort of became someone who was quite excited about school. I wouldn't say that that was shared by everyone in my cohort. We have reunions often, like every 5 years our class gets together, and I'm kind of astonished by how different our experiences were and how much more we are open and almost radically honest with one another now than we were then, which is a large reason why this project started. So here I am in all my 80s glory with my feathered hair, because it was mandatory, obviously, to have feathered hair. And I was into sports, and I loved school. It was a really good place to connect with other people and, again, with the world. And it was definitely a place that was also riddled with problems. And some of those issues were around things that we didn't even have words for, right? Like bullying and sexual harassment. And a lot of that was not simply between students, but between educators, coaches, and students in the classes, to the point where a lot of this would be sort of maybe criticized or critiqued in our small groups, but we didn't know what kinds of leverage or power we had to change the system. So the model was very much about the individual, like you work it out as an individual or you work it out amongst your friend groups. But we didn't have any sort of awareness, I think, of broader systems and system change. So here I am, flash forward, I'm still with the Tiger, go Tigers. And I'm back in the front office, the principal's sort of waiting area there at MUHS in Middlebury, Vermont. And I'm getting ready to go with my students into these holistic workshops, these wellness workshops that we have designed and that we're piloting in area high schools. I think over the course of my entire career, I've been interested in anthropologies of coming and going. And part of this sort of materialized as an anthropologist with my research in India. And this is kind of an amazing coming of age for me today. This morning, I sent off my book manuscript. So it's kind of an amazing moment as an anthropologist to get your first book manuscript sent off. It's taken me a long time. It's a very long coming of age. But I used this image on the front here to really open, literally, this is a gate to Adyar Beach in the southern part of Chennai in southern India. And this is the ocean and a place where I used to go quite a bit during my field work to think. And to think about the kinds of information and interviews, most of which were not happening in English, mostly in Urdu and Hindi. And to really kind of process my fieldwork experiences as well as all of the different information that was coming in about passages and practices of health, medicine, gender, the body, kinship, all of which are still relevant to the project that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm, with this slide, sort of trying to give you a sense of a thread, even though it might seem very distant or geographically separate from where we are now in Vermont. These kinds of sort of resonances with the body and what we mean to one another over time, especially when it comes to heritage medicine and the kinds of ways we look back into the past to pull particular ingredients toward the future, is really relevant to the project I'm about to discuss. So I'd like to take a little moment just to step back in time and talk a little bit about Margaret Mead's work and this whole notion of coming of age and how that's been very much made useful in anthropology, as well as sort of talk about the relevance of that particular concept for how we think about youth and digital culture, and then come toward a set of what I'm calling sort of cultural narratives or tableaus for how the public kind of imagines youth digital culture. As well as sort of think about the limits of our popular imagination and our scientific techniques for making sense of those. What I'm trying to get to ultimately, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this, is if we can kind of step back from some of these more static narratives and think more about youth culture as something that people do every day, rather than something simply received or instructed. So, starting with Margaret Mead, and you can sense from these images that I've selected, she is, as the kids would say, a very iconic figure in American anthropology. Many of you will probably, recognize the slogan on the left: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So she's quite known for that. She's known for coming of age in Samoa. She's known for her work in Polynesia and the South Pacific. And she's also there in the middle, quite a legendary figure in her early 70s there with a long cape and staff. This was what she wore and sort of how she comported herself every day as she walked around campus. And then, of course, she, as a public intellectual, became so high profile that she also was minted with a stamp. So across all of these images, you see the sort of public figure that she had become. But this was not without controversy, and certainly one of the largest controversies swirling both at the time of the publication of the work and throughout her life was this publication. So many of you will remember Coming of Age in Samoa as one of the sort of iconic or legendary publications in social studies of adolescence. And it came out in 1928. This was after she had traveled at the age of 23 to Samoa in 1925 under the guidance of Franz Boas, who is known as the father of cultural anthropology. He was at Columbia University in New York City, and his work was particularly known and sort of important for its critique of race. In part, he and his students were very committed and interested in establishing culture as a concept that would enable a sort of critical approach to things like race, immigration, and other forms of social experience as just that, as social cultural experiences, and not biologically, or sort of, this was before all of the genetic discussions, but not as a biological essentialism. So they were very interested in, using culture to critique the nature versus nurture divide. And she, with that interest, published this book. So I would say that was really kind of the first thing she was trying to do, is disturb or disrupt this nature-nurture dichotomy and really show the importance of local, cultural understandings, socialization, and environmental influences on the shaping of life change. So rather than saying, adolescence is just this one thing, it's this sort of natural, biological stage, or this, the other sort of naturalization that was going on at the early period, or early 20th century, was this assumption that adolescence was exclusively sort of a period of rebellion. And this was becoming a more and more reductive narrative in American popular culture. And so she, not the only person to do this, but really sort of known for disrupting the idea that adolescence is either universal, essential in a biological sense, and unchanging. Later, anthropologists like Victor Turner took this idea of coming of age and used it to really look at a significant, or to sort of, formulate a significant model of social change known as rite of passage. He was borrowing this from the linguist Arnold van Gennep, who in 1908 had written about rite de passage in French. And Arnold van Gennep was interested in these social moments in people's lives where they are separated from the group, either by themselves or with their age mates. they undergo a period of transition, and then they come out the other side into this newly minted form of personhood and are reincorporated into the group. So for example, birth, marriage, death, and coming of age. So initiation ceremonies like both on the one hand, religious ceremonies like a bar or bat mitzvah, first communion, as well as things like graduation and divorce, were thought of as these places where you would travel from one life stage to another, crossing that threshold and not really ever going back. There was this sense of linearity to it suggested by those arrows. Victor Turner was interested in that progression, but he was really interested in the moment in between, the transition moment. He was particularly fascinated with what liminality could do for people and what it made possible or permissible. In his book, The Ritual Process, he draws on his work in the Central African Republic to talk about boys coming of age and the uses of this kind of time period to suspend the normal order or social order of things. It didn't mean that this was some kind of blank slate, that the boy was sort of, removed or evacuated from a social context, but rather it was an interstructural moment, a moment of being hyphenated or suspended between one state and another, and in that state, very possible, very potential for something else. He also was very interested in the anti-structural possibilities because he was himself coming of age as an anthropologist in the 60s. And his work was very influential and very much, taken up. Do you want to come in? You can come in. Very much influenced and influential toward the Beat generation. So he was both really interested in the Beats were interested in him, but he was also in the 60s, obviously, looking for sort of structural reversals and structural rebellions, if you will, resistances that influenced his work, right? So it's an interesting sort of, I think, lesson both for Mead and for Turner, as well as myself, to realize that we are permeable. Our social models for understanding behavior and change are very much affected by the intellectual and political climates in which we are growing. So what he saw and located in that interstitial moment was really this time of ambiguity, of real possibility, permissibility, and even equivalency. Right? The possibility that people could be equal with one another. He also called it poetically sacred poverty and fruitful darkness, both really interesting phrases for that liminal stage. What he was also trying to do was, like Mead, look toward a way of theorizing and making scientific sense of age change or this sort of stage of youth. But at the same time, people like Dick Hebdige, who's a sociologist, British sociologist, were looking around their own culture, specifically in the UK, to pick up a lot of kinds of signs and signals of what was changing in the 1950s and 1960s British culture, especially popular culture, and what that would say about what he coined as subculture. So he's very well known for his notion of youth subculture, and that's when we talk about youth culture or youth subculture, that's where we're getting it from. He was especially interested in the movement of cultural styles and trends from one group to another. And that would include cultural appropriation. So he's very interested in the movement of Black styles and trends from fashion to music to political style to street style, to bring all of that and to understand how that was being taken up by white subgroups of youth, including hipsters, beats, and punks. The liminal period is also, I think, for youth particularly timely and interesting to consider right now as we're about to celebrate Halloween. And here you see, I would call this a meme because it's so popularly reproduced and circulated online. It's also a very popular jack-o'-lantern carving. I'm sure many of you have probably seen it on the sides of your neighborhoods. But what I think Halloween helps us to understand is that typically for children, I'm not sure for youth, but for children, this is a very exciting time of possibility. It's, dusk, so it's the time between daylight and night. It's the time between summer and winter. It's the time when they can dress up and be something else. And I think many of them literally believe that they are someone else that night and probably for several weeks afterward. And it's a time of, spooks and ghosts and scary stories and the possibility that the supernatural is very close by and is coming in and out of this mortal realm. This, and we tried to play the audio, so I apologize in advance. This particular reel did not play audio when we tested it, so I'm going to play it and sort of, you can read along with the subtitles. It's better when you can actually listen to it, so hopefully you can go back and listen to her voice because the emotion in her voice is very palpable. But let's give a listen and see what's going on in this particular reel. So it's a good, I think, place to start a conversation around who feels included, who feels like they fit in or don't fit in. And, this very real possibility that youth, teenagers, et cetera, who are coming to people's doors might, really still enjoy being kids. And, I think for many of us who still do enjoy Halloween, I do, that's not such a distant, possibility. And I think it sort of behooves us to think a little bit more about what we mean by age and the delimits or, parameters that we set around age. And so I also really appreciate her use, or maybe she didn't realize this, but the use of the word tricky, because trick or treat, obviously, the trick or the treat of Halloween, this is more serious, the sense of that time period of one's life being uncertain and tricky to navigate. It was because of, a lot of these sorts of questions that in 2017, enough students at the University of Toronto, where I used to teach before I moved to Middlebury College, were coming and saying, we really want to investigate these questions at closer range. Is there a way for us to do that, research? Can we start something with you? And I thought about it, and at first I thought, well, maybe we could do like a group independent study or, like a course, a reading course. But then I realized that what we were really looking at with all of these different platforms that people were using, Instagram, Tumblr, Twitter, YouTube, that it was really kind of important to have a set of methods that we could learn together and then also have students have time to really engage with these projects and be able to write about them. So we started the Body Online Lab, and these are the first group of students that I worked with in Toronto. These are the students giving presentations at the Society for Cultural Anthropology meeting that happened that year. And we were really interested in sort of inspired by the work of Dana Boyd, who is a senior researcher at Microsoft and as well an adjunct, an affiliated faculty member at Georgetown. And Dana's work is really, it's really cool. I mean, this book is really legendary. 2014, she publishes It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Networked Teens, and since then has done quite a lot of other work in this area. But these were the kinds of touchstones in social anthropology and cultural studies that we were going to make sense of some of these images you see on the right in terms of online experiences of youth. So, you know, from political movements in Toronto around anti-Black violence, Islamophobia, the sort of interests of trans and queer youth to be recognized and validated in public space, including at University of Toronto, and for also along the whole gamut for mental health services to not just be something that people were talking about in terms of access, but really looking at the kinds of relationships that were being afforded and made possible for students in terms of mental health. And so what my students were basically saying was, you know, we cannot find a real sort of connection and lasting relationship with the mental health services on campus. We've tried. And what we're afraid of is that things are going to get really critical and mental health is really going to continue to go down if we don't find alternatives. And one of the places that one of my students who was the really inspiration for the lab, Katrina Elmsley, she said, you know, I really want to look on Tumblr, which is not really used as much anymore, but at that point I want to look at Tumblr and I want to look at the expressions of neurodiversity and community building in that space. And so I said, great, that's awesome, and here are some methods, and we talked about how to go about that, and we got IRB approval. And she went and she did that project. And it was really important, I think, as one of the first things we did as a lab, to come together and talk about these particular digital platforms as not simply places where people met and chatted, like a chat room, but places where they actually felt a sense of well-being, a sense of connection and lasting possibility for their mental health. So without saying that that was some kind of replacement, you know, obviously for clinical care, if folks need it, we continue to move from there and look at other areas of, you know, basically what was happening with kids, what were they thinking about, and how were they talking very, you know, often, like daily, all day, on social media about these issues. As you know, if you read the New York Times, there's a lot of sort of series now being set up. One of the series that's in the New York Times right now is about adolescent mental health. And it's almost always, you know, framed as a crisis. And there is a lot of this, you know, that is of merit and important to look at coming out of the pandemic. The other thing that is actually talked about less is the mental health of teachers. Although if you look on various social media platforms, it's a much more common discussion than it is in some of our mainstream news outlets like the New York Times. But this is just a few statistics regarding the mental health of teachers in 2023. And this is the United States. 42% of teachers are suffering from mental health problems. Only 10% of teachers would strongly recommend the profession to others. 35% are hoping to quit within the next 2 years. 80% of educators are taking on more work because of teaching shortages, and 78% are suffering from major financial stress. And these are high school, secondary level so middle and high school teachers. With that, sort of those harrowing statistics in mind, we are sort of, I think, compelled to think about the future of schooling in general, but also what schools can be, how they can be better for kids as well as educators. I use these two examples to show sort of the pandemic experience as I understand it from my students and our interlocutors in these studies, as well as my own experience with my child, who was 3 and 4 and now 5 during the pandemic. But there was, we're seeing very different fallouts, if you will, or effects of the pandemic based on age. And for a variety of reasons, the age between 10 and 13, so now these folks are in basically 10th graders, so 10th, 11th graders, really had a tough time. And I think it's obviously important to look at, age in that scenario and think about all the kinds of things that are set up institutionally for them at that moment, as well as what they're personally going through, the importance of peers, the importance of having teachers there for that transition from more, sort of structured instruction toward project-based learning that can be very, important to do one-on-one with a teacher. And then even, the kinds of developmental needs that kids are going through where they weren't able to talk to a counselor or talk to a therapist or a nurse in person. So these were literally sort of leading to some shattered expectations and real moral and psychological distress. My lab, luckily, was already online in a way because it's the body online. And we have collaborators in Toronto as well as Middlebury. So when Middlebury College students were very suddenly sent home, and that, is obviously very important to understand that kids were often being sort of removed or evacuated quite quickly. Even though that particular, turbulence was happening, we were still able to kind of regroup and come together over the summer and have a summer collective, which was really wonderful because then we could really get back down into, these issues around or sort of variables of social media use. So one of the things that we do in anthropology is we sort of look at some of the statistics and the sort of big figures, and then we sort of look beyond and within those numbers. Sometimes we also challenge those numbers by saying, okay, that's very important to sort of see, make certain priorities, but then how can we understand people's lived experiences? So here we have a bunch of data coming out, and this is 2023 from the Surgeon General's office at the Department of Health and Human Services. So this is national level data. So 95% of youth reporting using social media, more than 1/3 almost constantly, for an average of 3.5 hours a day. And then reporting, these are the students themselves, reporting increased prevalence of mental health challenges, including anxiety, depression, disturbed sleep, eating disorders, and other kinds of social and emotional problems with social and emotional regulation. 64% of youth reported often or sometimes being exposed to hate-based content, and a very high number disproportionately affecting adolescent girls and trans youth, reporting significantly higher levels of harassment, abuse, and cyberbullying. 40% of youth, when asked, how does it make you feel, reported social media made them feel worse. 40% said neither better or worse, and 14% said better. At the same time, I really love The Atlantic, so I'm going to cite that. In publications like The Atlantic, we see a little more of a sort of complex analysis of things like empathy and where and how we are, according to this author, inured. So this is just like a sort of a brief view of this article, but we can blame government or capitalism or any number of things, but it's hard not to see a social shift. This shouldn't be surprising. Empathy is cultivated through interactions with people we don't know well, those glimpses into other interior worlds. We have, over the past 2 decades, slowly and then quickly optimized other people out of our lives. One app at a time, we've greatly reduced our need to casually engage with anyone we don't know, or even to meaningfully engage with those we do. And so what Gonzalez, the author, goes on to talk about are all the sort of cultural particulars of how, why, when, where that lack of engagement is taking place, and some of the implications of that for human connection. This is an interesting sort of report, again, from the Health and Human Services about the effects of social media. So this is the same report I had just cited. So whereas Gonzalez in the Atlantic is sort of offering a number of different sort of cultural analyses and pretty complex historical possibilities for that erosion of empathy. This report is, albeit it's a thumbnail sketch, and again, it's used as a policy guidance, but this report is basically, pointing toward some of the suggestions or recommendations that the Health and Human Services are making. So, for example, there's a lot of, glamour or sort of like excitement about social media and AI in particular, but a lack of robust independent safety analyses of the effects of these. So they're pointing to this urgent need to do more research. Some of the questions they're raising, I think, are really, really good ones, like how do in-person versus digital social interactions differ in terms of those variables? What are potential pathways through which social media may cause harm and well-being? So they are allowing for the fact that social media does, create connection and well-being. For type of content, and now they're going into those like different sort of axes or slices of use. So content, type of device, frequency, like how many hours per day, how many times per week, which users and why. And then they're looking more critically at beneficial effects for whom and in what ways, and so forth and so on. What I like about this, which is a turn from like 10 years ago, is that the Department of Health and Human Services is actually interested in qualitative questions. So, from a humanities point of view, it's pretty exciting to see at the top sort of levels of our public health structure in the United States this interest. Nevertheless, there's no mention of anthropology. It's often, and in fact, at the very bottom of the report, they're saying, what's needed is more research from psychologists and, educators and policy analysts. But what's interesting is that anthropology is not included there, and I obviously think it should be. And one of the reasons I think it should be is because anthropology is well positioned to understand narrative. And this, of course, is a humanities question as well, but what are the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves that we fall in love with? And what are these stories, why are we particularly, drawn to believe in these stories, despite contrary evidence too? So this is like the power of myth, basically. And I'm not saying that these particular claims about the toxic effects of social media or that it's pulling our fabric apart or that we're all becoming less empathetic are not true. I think there is some truth to that. But for whom? How? And what are the actual narratives that people are saying within those prevailing larger narratives? So part of how I see our lab kind of tackling this, and this is the sort of last part of the talk that I'm getting to, is taking these sort of larger, we could call them hegemonic because they're very powerful modes of making sense, right? Things that we believe in strongly to be common sense at this point. And taking those common sense narratives and breaking them up into smaller pieces, pieces that are sometimes coming together and sometimes not, because people are very different. So I'm not going to go into each of these, but I will sort of touch on these thematics as we go forward. So one of the things that we can say, if we look across these cultural narratives and the kinds of information they're giving people, is that social media is functioning as a social institution. And the reason why I want to be really clear and sort of emphatic about this, and I get this especially from Elio's, the conversation I had with one of my student collaborators 2 days ago, is that if we look at things like the role of ritual or religion or particular periods of celebration historically, those were sort of time out or time away, what Victor Turner and others called interstructural moments. Those were moments where people could kind of pull back and do that kind of liminal possible work that we talked about. Social media is also a social institution because it gives people so much information and so many kinds of codes of conduct and particular sort of, like influences, if you will, to use influencer culture as a example, that it really is not necessarily replacing religion, but it's definitely having the role of, giving people a sense of self-worth, even though that's not necessarily always happening. It's giving people information about themselves, about their world. It's giving people particular, scripts and codes and norms, and it's giving people a sense of connection with one another. It's also giving people a lot of not great stuff. So, some of the stuff that I just mentioned, including this sense of, toxic culture or toxicity. And that's a very sort of lengthy conversation. But this term, if you just do a search for toxic in Google, you'll get a number of answers to why that would be such a powerful term and why it would be such a compelling narrative. So if we can, sort of locate and really, I think, emphatically situate social media as a social institution, I think it enables us to really start looking at the ways in which social media operates to both give people information and, a sense of meaning, as well as take that on. And I think that reciprocal relation of the social is really important. One of the things that I'm always thinking about in a talk like this is, what do we mean by social and what do we mean by more than social, or human and more than human? Because when we're talking about media and technology, we're also looking at, the kind of sense of what is our bounded sense of the human. Do we have borders to our bodies? If I always have my phone in my hand when I'm walking around and I'm thinking, even when it's turned down on a table and I'm interacting with people at dinner, if I still feel its presence, does that mean that it's a part of me? And I would say absolutely yes. I absolutely do feel this invisible leash, this tethering, the umbilical cord. And I definitely feel that more over time than in the past. And my students have said the same, if they feel as though they are paying too much attention to their phones. I have noticed actually lately that the silent function or the notifications off will be popping up on a text. And I'm actually really happy to see that, because it means that they're actually looking out for their own, digital care and not constantly being interrupted and told what's happening in the broader world. So these are kind of some of the slippages, or sort of ambivalent areas between, or slippery areas between the human and non-human, or artificial intelligence in this case. So Jacob was interested in my bringing AI into this talk, and I was very excited to do that. This is more, it's so new, obviously, a lot of this stuff, including this particular technology, this app within an app called Be Fake. They're so new, and they're really just kind of coming out and being visible that it's not something that we've even really looked at yet. So I just went to sort of, grabbed a couple images and sort of proposed them as maybe a chance to sort of bring up a conversation. But here's someone, an actual person, Haley Flagel, who says that, when they're using this particular platform, they're really enjoying giving a little bit of a more personal view of who they are. So I just grabbed that little quote there because I thought that was very useful. What's interesting is that, none of these, I'm guessing this is some of her original face, but I'm not sure. But what's interesting about, the kind of artful design here is that it's suggesting something else about this person in each different frame. And I think that's the story that they really want to tell about themselves. In fact, they start to sort of say, in this scenario, I really wanted to look, I think they said that they wanted to look like they were on the beach and relaxing. And so there's a kind of story that goes with each of these images. And so in effect, what this technology helps people to do is tell a story about themselves through kind of what looks to be kind of a mashup of virtual reality and Photoshop. Just as there's like a whole suite of articles dedicated to adolescent mental health, there's also now in the New York Times, you can go and see all of these different, corners of the internet that are dealing with AI and chatbots, ChatGPT and sort of large language models. Meta, that's the owner of Facebook and Instagram, and their characters, like actual sort of characters that they're creating, and image generation. So this is someone who's using, I can't remember the name of this. I think it's called a can of soup. That's right. And this particular, again, it's like an in-app tool. So it goes within an application like Instagram, and you can basically create different scenarios of yourself with your friends by taking an existing image and then detailing it and fancifying it. And, and then talking and then trading these like stickers, right? Or like trading cards back in the day with your friends, and almost like passing notes, like creating these scenarios and these kind of fantastical realities with your friends. And they're also available as stickers, like you can print them out and like put them on things, which I don't know if you've noticed, like there's this whole thing with stickers with water bottles and laptops. I'm actually really out of it because I don't have any on this laptop. So I feel like, but I do on my phone because my daughter just plastered it back on my phone with stickers. But what I'm using this image to sort of ask about is the connection between AI and social media. So AI is not separate from, it's now being used as these kind of in-app or standalone app enhancements for the kinds of communication, information and storytelling that social media has been already doing. The other thing that's come up, obviously, is the ethics of AI, and a lot of you are probably following this pretty closely. And what we see is this continuing sort of interest in children's rights and the protection of the child. So, as Foucault said, the child is not some, sort of naturally evident entity. It is a creation, and it is a, sort of a, it's something that had come out of the Victorian era as a subject of concern, and as an object of discipline. And so Foucault's argument is that, in the construction of a bunch of institutions like psychotherapy and even education and, clinical medicine, there was an interest in designating the child as a very special, child and adolescent, as a special and deserving place of state intervention. And, clearly, I'm not making an argument, of course, again, that children's rights and, the understanding of like what kids can reasonably look forward to in terms of, big tech actually stepping up and creating some, like regulations around the use of these technologies. I'm not saying that, that's not important. It clearly is that big tech take on these regulatory responsibilities. But again, when we talk about opportunities and risks, these are very fruitful and I think important areas to look at from a qualitative and critical lens. There's a lot of information coming out about parents and their concerns, the feeling that they're lagging behind, that some of these AI technologies and big language models have not really had any kind of regulations or rules built into them. But this is actually, much more common to sort of talk about it in this almost moral panic kind of way, like, oh my God, it's taking over, than to actually talk about people's uses of it in the everyday. And I think that might be actually quite a much more sort of productive place to start. And I did find evidence that this is actually something that some companies are jumping on. So if we think about the ethics of like governance, and again, like, can AI, is it going to control us, or are we going to control it? Who is actually doing the sort of gatekeeping? There's a company called Anthropic. I think I got it right here. Yeah, here it is. And interestingly called Anthropic, which is obviously very close to anthropology, from the same root word for person. But the thing that they're trying now, having already tried constitutional AI being kind of like the input of, existing regulations on, sort of Apple's, terms of use, combined with the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Like, it was this kind of interesting sort of mashup, again, amalgamation of what the bot had done to sort of go out and, find stuff related to rights and kind of move it and mash it up to, no, I'm not saying it was like some kind of like weird thing. It actually did make sense. But what they found was they needed a more collective, input. And so what they did was they asked a whole bunch of people to, weigh in, and, they sort of crowdsourced this amongst more than 1,000 users in the United States. And they came up with something that was actually not that far away from the constitutional model. So the collective constitutional was the crowd-based, and it was based on human users. The constitutional model was the one before it, which was the Apple user and UN Declaration on Human Rights. Both of them, obviously being so close, and similar, had something in common, which is that they did not consider and have not considered yet questions like, should these chatbots, if they're in Saudi Arabia, be trained according to Saudi values? And if you go down here, should a bot respond to questions about abortion in a majority Catholic country, or trans rights in America with a Republican-controlled Congress? So these kinds of questions about AI vis-a-vis voice, values, worldview, whose perspective are we talking about, are really critical for the uses of AI in all of these different areas. So if we think about, like, who's going to tell us how and when to turn on a street. You'll notice, like Siri and other kinds of navigation, you can actually choose different gendered voices, but most of the like at-home helpers, like I'm trying to remember the ones that are at home that you use, that you talk to. Yes, thank you. Most of them have these female presenting voices, and those voices are assistants, right? And so then you see an interesting sort of gendering of the bot through the voice and the type of sound that's used. So there's like more to be said here. Obviously, this is kind of a brave new world, if you will. But I did want to just sort of bring that up as an area that we'll be looking at more closely in the lab. So just to very briefly show you what we've been doing to, I think, both get curious and understand all of this stuff better, but also use this as an opportunity to do some really cool, like, community engaged research with our partners in the schools. And give also, my ulterior motive is a little bit interesting. I'm really interested and keen to recruit graduates of Middlemark College back into, progressive health education and, in the health humanities, both here in Vermont as well as elsewhere. So I do have a lot of students who are pre-health and pre-med. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. And we see a lot more people interested in the medical sciences as of the pandemic. But there are a lot of other health professions that we can work on cultivating. So here's the lab. Right now you can see it's growing. It's growing a lot. And largely because we have this funding, including from various humanities funders that I'll talk about in a moment, that's enabled us to really reach beyond some of our, anthropological domain to think about critical health humanities. So really opening it up to digital storytelling, to relational health workshop design, and to the ways of like bringing some of these methods into clinics in our community. So some of the stuff that we've been looking to do in the last couple of years that we're doing also right now. We, through our ethnographic research, as well as the stuff that I had screened earlier, really settled on these 7 areas. So these aren't arbitrary. These are very much coming out of students themselves, as well as the state level data from the YRBS, as well as our community partners. So each of these has a group of students, 2 to 3 students, who are doing research in community as well as literature to put together an 80-minute workshop. And then that is then delivered usually once per semester. We might go up from that at local area high schools in our community. This would not be possible without our collaborators on the health provider side. So these are some of the nurses in Addison County who we're collaborating with. And we're doing the collaboration, but we're also, as part of that, interviewing people. So this is a part of a study that we started a couple years ago during the pandemic that's been really useful to how we think about, but also imagine school health otherwise. Some of our meetings, obviously, they need to include food because that's what brings people together. And then, we're obviously looking at some of these data. This is just examples of very high level of folks not using condoms. If you see 50% and then 41% not using, if you subtract and do the math. And this is tracking with CDC data, high numbers of STIs, including over the pandemic, interestingly. And this is what has really driven the Vermont Department of Health and all of its collaborators on sexual health to basically deliver this. Here it is making national news in 2021. So we're the first state in a lot of ways, actually. We also, passed the Universal Child Care Act this summer. But we're the first state to require access to condoms in all public middle and high schools. And here are the Vermont statutes online. You can go and look up the whole kit and caboodle. But this is very interesting. It's mandated to not just exist in a school, but be in a school in multiple settings. So not just in the nurse's office, not just at a highly trafficked area where people can go into their bag, but like at different places around the school where people can really have access and have free access and meaningful access. We wanted to go one step further, and so what we did was when the sexual and relational health group went in, we put together these goodie bags, which are on the back here. And these were full of like really great information, flyers, resources, as well as things like internal and external condoms. Because the thing about condoms is that they're often gendered. They're called female or male, so we're trying to get away from that. And they're also often distributed without any lubricant. And this is very, very obviously not okay, because everyone needs lube. And also the fact is saliva is not a good lubricant, right? Because obviously STIs, right? So the idea was that something colorful, something fun, and also something relatable to youth. The reception has been excellent. Here's our other group going in for chronic illness and disability. So starting with activities that are really, evidence-based, along national and state guidelines of comprehensive, inclusive health education. What do students need to hear based on the science? And these are all things that are obviously very well evidenced, and the state of Vermont is really leading the nation in a lot of regards. But we need more of this, right? Because it's not well funded. School health educators often are beleaguered in terms of what they can get through in their curriculum. They have very little time, and often they don't see students for more than one semester for the entire high school period. Like they can maybe only have a few months with the student before they move on to other years. So there's a lot of content to get through. And we, as a lab, want to make sure that that particular moment is going to be as good as it can be, because it could have a very lasting impact on someone's health and safety. So we want to make sure that it's done well. And so in that regard, we're very, very grateful to be funded by the University of New Hampshire Center for the Humanities and their Mellon grant, as well as Middlebury College and some state of Vermont funding, to develop these workshops, which, these are the workshops that I just mentioned in terms of what the students are doing. We are putting together, extensive resource lists that are posted and will be posted. We're also developing, with this funding this year right now, pedagogy, that it's sort of like train the trainer model. So people who are experts in critical health humanities, in public humanities, are coming to work with the students in our lab to make sure that they have the kit, of skills and tricks and fun stuff and relatable stuff that will make a difference, and that will also be interesting to other publics, right, beyond the classroom. So these are just a few of our workshops. We have someone who has just delivered a workshop on trauma-informed health education and student stress responses. We have Lily coming this Friday from University of New Hampshire, talking about queer storytelling and flash oral memoir in the public humanities. Cassie Tank's coming to talk about strategies for intergenerational public humanities. She's working with a lot of BIPOC youth and their interviews of elders in community in order to record stories from the sort of World War II and Vietnam War era, and to bring those stories into the public. And then Elio, who I'd mentioned earlier, coming to talk and train us in queer health, justice, and futures. So where does this sort of bring us in our work? I have tried in this talk today to talk about coming of age in terms of its being like one time or space is not bounded. There are ways that we can think of it as special and in need of our attention, but I think a lot of times we can get more creative in terms of looking beyond the school, beyond the body, and beyond the sort of adolescent experience as bounded. What do we get when we do that? I think what we get is we don't get a passage from one stage of life or phase to another. We get instead something more like the metaphor of the strangler fig tree, which, as you can see on this post, reads, "As the fig's roots grow, they cascade down the trunk. Once they are in the ground, it competes for nutrients and water. Then it gradually tightens its grip around the host tree. This process hinders the flow of water and nutrients, causing the host tree to weaken and eventually die. Over time, the strangler fig takes over completely. Once the process is complete and the original tree decomposes, a hollow center is all that remains to mark its existence. So it sounds a little more possibly violent than I meant to say, but what's really beautiful about it is the kind of like shedding. It's like a molting kind of image, but it's still there, right? That sort of part of ourselves that is the kid, that is the youth, is still there. And I think this is really where I wanted to leave off in terms of further directions. For those of you who are adults tuning in, regardless of what age or life stage you're at, where and how do you think about friendship? Where and how do you think about things like connection, attention, and this beautiful metaphor from Catherine May about wintering and the importance of rest and retreat. These are all super important ways to think beyond coming of age to what we can be better and I think more expansively with each other. Oops. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions.
Okay.
I need to steal your mic.
Oh, of course. This one right here?
Yes. That way everyone can hear.
Okay, sure.
So any questions from our audience here? I guess I have one to start. So I've been reading a lot about kind of the importance of play in adult life. And so I was wondering kind of through your work with the online mediums and whatnot, what research has there been that kind of either highlighting play in social media or continuing that once students reach adult?
Yeah, and are you talking about play like on digital platforms and like gaming, or are you talking about play in the classroom with like games and play in the classroom or outside or all of it?
I think all of it, more like, since the social interaction part is so important in play.
For
how
sure.
is that translating in digital spaces?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question because during the pandemic, I think we all sort of started to lose our mind, or did, right? Because it was just so one-dimensional, right? Zoom, apologies to the people online because I know you're tuning in and can maybe appreciate what we're doing here, but I think when you're together with people, you can really get a feel for the dimensionality of people and what they bring, and gestures, improvisations, they're so important, I think, to all of us, but especially to youth. So when you're together reading people's body language and just kind of sensing people's support, those would just be a few examples. But what we are trying to play with, literally, in our lab now is critical play. So the idea behind that is something that I've been trying out in some of my classrooms. So the idea that, and this is not particularly new, that pedagogy has really gotten far away from just PowerPoint. So while that kind of presentational content and it can be very useful and like that kind of information about like how do we do this particular ethnographic research method, like what are the ways some people have actually done interviews before, what's important to pay attention to when you do an interview, what not to do when you're interviewing someone. All of that is like super important guidance, but we can also do that outside, right? And so just recently we had some guests come into my ethnographic research class, and we went outside and we just paid attention to our environment, and we talked about the body as the first instrument, the first research instrument. And then we went all the way into sensorial ethnography. So methods of, playing with food as a kind of, culinary ethnography, like actually putting together a feast or putting together a cookbook as an ethnographic research, or a soundscape. There's so many different kinds of ways that we can both use technology to create things that are playful for other people to watch, but I think also in the process have some fun ourselves doing it in research.
Anyone else? Yeah.
So is information collected from throughout the state or just certain counties, or how did that work?
So for some, that's a really good question. For some of the research that we've done with school nurses, we were doing that statewide. So we were doing more of a purposeful sample, trying to get a mix of different counties, middle and high school providers of different, years of experience, and to get their feedback on what their students were going through during the pandemic. So that was really about student health and well-being in all of its different permutations, especially during the pandemic. Coming out of that, we've actually opened it up to other school-based health providers, and that's been primarily in Addison County. So mental health clinicians, pediatricians who are collaborating on these school-based health centers that we now have in 2 of our schools, which is amazing, and health educators. Including people both in counseling as well as in, the sort of classroom-based role. So across the board, we're getting really interesting but also consistent results or themes, if you will, around the importance in a small community of the network. The person who's on your phone who you can call to get a resource for a student like that day. So these informal networks is number one. Because we're not in a capacity or a place where we live in Addison County where we can, like a Dartmouth Hitchcock, we in fact, a lot of us come down here for I don't, but there are a lot of people who come down here for that because that is like a comprehensive healthcare center that we don't have. So in lieu of that, that kind of like informal network is really important for stitching people together. And then, secondly, just the prevalence of mental health needs across the board and in very sort of complex ways, like not simply diagnoses of this or that, but, again, these practitioners telling us about things that students are, that are happening that students are, reacting to in different ways because they didn't necessarily have the kind of interactions with each other for 2 or 3 years in a consistent way that their peers, their older or younger peers had. And I think it's about resilience and about the kinds of models that people get when they're in person. And also about the fact that being at home was not always safe and valuable for kids. They didn't get necessarily the kinds of modeling that they might have if they were in a school. But not that schools are always the be-all and end-all of modeling, but there is a lot to be gained from having a bunch of adults available to talk to.
Yeah, I just have a question about, I know that the New York Times and some other news outlets talked a little bit about the Luddite teen, that there was this sort of flashback. And I wonder, since starting The Body Online in 2017, and here it is almost 2024, if you've seen any real-life anecdotal evidence that there are teens or people just making different choices about their digital life.
Okay, you actually reminded me of something I should have said during the presentation. It's actually one of the most important points, which is when the lab reconvened, or I guess we reconvene every fall, but particularly in the last 2 years, since the slide with all the different Zoom boxes, right? Since that time, as soon as we got back into in person, people are like, when can we go to the school? Like, we're not, when can we go outside? We're not going to do any of this, like, I'm not going to stare at Instagram anymore. So not only did they not want to do research on that, or at least not that exclusively, but they were much more interested to the point where we were considering changing the name of the lab. Because they were like, yeah, we need to look at these sources of information online, obviously, and make sense of how kids are using those for health ed or for sexual health ed, et cetera, or just like how to be a teen. But, that's not all of what we do and what we want to do. And so the model or the sort of like paradigm shifted dramatically toward how can we, yes, use some of these digital sources of information, including social media, to like glean information that's important to making these workshops relatable. But how can we use the workshops as a way to turn and really kind of turn ourselves away from our phones and, oh, it's still there, turn away just for, that period of time to really have what we're calling relational health. So I guess we're not arguing that relationships dissolve or relational health doesn't exist online. In fact, online has been, a very important, proven site for, especially in rural communities, people feeling connected around queer identity, right? And feeling not lost or like isolated, that you have peers out there who you can talk to. And because the queer youth in our community really have noted themselves, in fact, friendship, as one of the most important sites of health, we're not gonna like move away. We're gonna really go into that and figure out, well, if friendship is where it's happening, where are friends able to meet? And it's not just online. It's the teen center, and it's like small groups and sort of other hangouts. So that's what we're looking at. And also, what's our responsibility to really like understand that health is not simply in a clinic. Health is in relation in a lot of ways, yeah.
Thank you. All right, I think that's a wrap.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been really fun, and I really appreciate the chance to get a little bit like deeper into the work.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.